He mocked his assistant with a fake invite, but her stunning arrival left everyone speechless. "Hi, my beautiful family. It's your Mr. Peter, and if you're here for the first time, welcome home. This space was made for love, honesty, and healing. You're not just visiting, you're family now. Let me begin with a prayer. Quiet, deep, and full of love. May peace find you the moment you need it most. May your heart feel held, even if no one sees your tears. May joy return to you in little ways, a kind message, a sweet memory, a story that stays. You are not forgotten, you are not invisible, you are deeply needed, and forever loved. Now, my sweet family, please don't leave this story halfway. It was written with care, every moment meant to hold you, and today, I'll be honest. When I see no likes or comments, it hurts. I begin to wonder, have you grown tired of me? Maybe I'm too emotional, but it's only because I love you. I can't imagine this life without you, and maybe one day, if I'm no longer here, no one will tell you, Mr. Peter is gone. So while I'm here, I give you my heart. Please rate this story out of 10 in the comments. Don't stay silent. Your voice means the world to me. Like, comment, share it with someone you care about. Let the world feel what I feel, the strength and beauty of this family. Let's begin. With all my love, always.
The sound of Jackson Rowland's Italian leather shoes against marble echoed through the 42nd floor of the Rowland Tower like gunshots, each step a declaration of power that made lesser mortals step aside. At 32, he commanded an empire worth $3 billion, and everyone in his path knew it. Henderson, those quarterly reports better be on my desk in 10 minutes, or you'll be explaining to unemployment why you can't meet a deadline. Jackson barked into his phone, not bothering to slow his stride as he approached the executive suite. His charcoal Armani suit was immaculate, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his green eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never known defeat. The glass doors to his office suite whispered open, revealing the pristine domain where Jackson Rowland ruled his technological kingdom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Seattle's skyline, while minimalist furniture and cutting-edge displays showcased the latest innovations from Rowland Industries. Everything was sterile, perfect, and utterly devoid of human warmth. Behind her desk in the outer office sat Daisy Renton, 28 years old and invisible in the way that only highly competent assistants could manage. Her oversized glasses reflected the glow of her computer screen as her fingers flew across the keyboard, responding to emails that would have taken most people hours to compose. Her conservative navy blazer and modest pencil skirt were chosen specifically to blend into the background, and her beautiful dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that revealed nothing of her true allure. "Coffee," Jackson commanded without looking at her, already focused on the stack of contracts awaiting his signature. "The real stuff, not that swill from the break room." "Already brewing, Mr. Rowland," Daisy replied in her professional tone, never lifting her eyes from her screen. "Your 10:30 with the Singapore team has been moved to 11:15 due to technical difficulties on their end. I've rescheduled your lunch with the venture capitalists accordingly, and the presentation materials for this afternoon's board meeting are ready for your review." Jackson paused for a fraction of a second, mildly impressed despite himself, then continued into his office. This was their routine, polished by 2 years of working together. She anticipated his needs with an efficiency that bordered on telepathic, managed his impossible schedule with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, and somehow made his chaotic business empire run like clockwork. In return, he paid her well and largely pretended she didn't exist as anything more than a particularly sophisticated piece of office equipment. The morning progressed with its usual intensity. Jackson tore through 3 conference calls, eviscerated a marketing proposal that he deemed catastrophically stupid, and negotiated a hostile takeover that would net Rowland Industries another 100 million in annual revenue. Through it all, Daisy worked silently in the outer office, fielding calls, managing crises, and ensuring that Jackson's day proceeded without the slightest inconvenience. It was during his lunch break, while reviewing the latest quarterly projections, that disaster struck in the form of Nathaniel Cross and Williams Burke, two of his oldest business associates and current partners in a lucrative defense contract. "Jackson, you magnificent bastard," Nathaniel boomed as he strode into the office without announcement, his silver hair gleaming and his expensive suit doing little to hide his considerable gut. Williams followed close behind, tall and thin, with the predatory smile of a man who'd built his fortune on other people's misery. "Gentlemen," Jackson stood, extending his hand with the practiced ease of someone who'd been schmoozing since childhood. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "The Pinnacle Awards Gala, of course," Williams said, settling into one of the leather chairs facing Jackson's desk. 3 weeks away, and the most important networking event of the year. I trust you've secured an appropriately stunning date?" Jackson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Pinnacle Awards were indeed crucial, a black-tie affair where Seattle's business elite gathered to celebrate technological innovation and, more importantly, to make deals worth billions. Last year, he'd attended with Miranda Castellanos, a supermodel whose beauty had been matched only by her complete lack of intellectual substance. The relationship had ended badly when she'd sold details of their private conversations to a gossip magazine. "I'm considering my options," Jackson replied smoothly, though internally he was cursing. In the chaos of recent business acquisitions, he'd completely forgotten about securing a date for the gala. Nathaniel chuckled, the sound unpleasant and knowing. "Ah, the eternal bachelor. You know, Williams and I were just discussing your romantic life, or rather, the lack thereof. It's becoming quite the topic of conversation in certain circles." "Is it now?" Jackson's voice carried a dangerous edge that would have warned smarter men to tread carefully. Williams, however, was not a smart man when it came to reading social cues. "Oh yes, quite the speculation. Some say you prefer the company of men. Others suggest you're simply too intimidated by intelligent women to pursue them. There's even a betting pool about whether you'll show up to the gala alone again." The insult hit its mark with surgical precision. Jackson's reputation was everything in his world. It determined business partnerships, secured investments, and maintained the respect that kept his empire intact. The suggestion that he was either gay or too weak to attract a worthy woman was exactly the kind of poison that could undermine everything he'd built. "Intimidated?" Jackson's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Gentlemen, I could have any woman in this city. I simply choose not to waste my time on the usual vapid socialites." "Then prove it," Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "Bring someone extraordinary to the gala. Someone who'll make every man in that room burn with envy." Jackson's mind raced through possibilities. His usual circle of potential companions were all variations on the same theme. Beautiful, wealthy, and ultimately forgettable. He needed someone who would make a statement, someone unexpected who would demonstrate his power to command the impossible. The soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Rowland." Daisy's voice was barely audible through the heavy wood. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Singapore team is ready for your conference call." "Come in," Jackson called, an idea beginning to form in his mind with the slow, inevitable certainty of an avalanche. Daisy entered with her usual quiet efficiency, tablet in hand and her attention focused on business. In her conservative clothing and severe hairstyle, she looked like every other overworked assistant in corporate America. But Jackson found himself studying her with new eyes, noting the graceful way she moved, the intelligence that sparkled behind her glasses, the quiet dignity that he'd been too blind to see. "Tell them I'll be with them in 5 minutes," he said, his voice carrying an odd undertone that made Daisy glance at him with surprise. "Of course, sir," she replied, turning to leave. "And Daisy," Jackson's voice stopped her at the door, "clear your calendar for the evening of the 23rd. She turned back, confusion evident in her expression. "The 23rd, sir. Is there a late meeting I should prepare for?" Jackson smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression that made both Nathaniel and Williams lean forward with interest. "In a manner of speaking, you'll be accompanying me to the Pinnacle Awards Gala." The silence that followed was deafening. Daisy's eyes widened behind her glasses, her tablet nearly slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Nathaniel and Williams exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of Jackson's assistant. I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Rowland," Daisy stammered, her professional composure cracking for the first time in Jackson's memory. "It's quite simple," Jackson said, enjoying the shock on everyone's faces. "You'll be my date for the evening. I trust that won't be a problem." Daisy's mind reeled as she tried to process what was happening. Jackson Rowland, the man who barely acknowledged her existence, who treated her like a piece of office furniture, who had never shown the slightest interest in her as a human being, was asking her to accompany him to the most exclusive social event in Seattle's business calendar. That is... She struggled to find words, acutely aware of the two strangers watching her with undisguised amusement. "I don't think I would be appropriate for such an event, sir." "Nonsense," Jackson waved away her objections with casual arrogance. "You're intelligent, professional, and certainly presentable. That's more than I can say for most of the women who attend these functions." The casual cruelty of his assessment, reducing her to a list of basic qualifications while simultaneously insulting an entire gender, reminded Daisy exactly why she'd been planning to update her resume. Working for Jackson Rowland was like being trapped in a beautiful, golden cage with a particularly magnificent and unpredictable tiger. But there was something else in his expression, something she couldn't quite identify. Was it desperation? Surely not. Jackson Rowland didn't do desperation. "Think of it as overtime," Jackson continued when she didn't respond immediately. "The gala is in 3 weeks. I'll compensate you appropriately for your time, naturally." And there it was. The final insult that crystallized everything Daisy had been feeling for months. He wasn't asking her as a man asking a woman, wasn't even asking her as a human being. He was giving her an assignment, another task to add to her endless list of responsibilities in service to his ego. "Of course, Mr. Rowland," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. "I'll make sure to clear my schedule." "Excellent." Jackson turned back to his business associates, already dismissing her from his thoughts. "Gentlemen, I believe that settles your concerns about my social life." Nathaniel and Williams were still chuckling as Daisy left the office, their conversation immediately turning to speculation about Jackson's chances of success with such an unremarkable companion. Their voices followed her as she closed the door, but their words were lost beneath the pounding of her heart and the sudden, fierce determination that was building in her chest. Jackson Rowland thought he was playing a game, using her as a pawn in whatever power struggle he was engaged in with his colleagues. He expected her to show up as his dowdy assistant, to provide a few hours of mild entertainment before returning to her designated role as invisible support staff. But as Daisy settled back at her desk and reached for her phone to call her best friend Nia, she was already imagining a very different kind of evening. Jackson Rowland was about to learn that underestimating Daisy Renton was the biggest mistake of his privileged, arrogant life. The game was about to change, and she intended to win. Chapter 2: The Transformation. 3 weeks had never passed so slowly in Jackson Rowland's life, yet somehow the day of the Pinnacle Awards Gala arrived with the shocking swiftness of an execution date. He stood in his penthouse bathroom, adjusting his black bow tie for the third time while trying to ignore the strange knot of anxiety that had taken residence in his stomach. The reflection staring back at him from the mirror was everything it should be. Perfectly groomed, dark hair, immaculate tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, green eyes that had charmed investors out of billions. So why did he feel like he was about to walk into a disaster of his own making? The Armani tuxedo fit him like liquid obsidian, the crisp white shirt a stark contrast against his tanned skin. His cufflinks were platinum and emerald, a gift from a grateful Saudi prince whose tech infrastructure Jackson had revolutionized. Every detail was perfect, calculated to project power and success to the 500 most influential people in Seattle's business community. But as he reached for his cologne, Jackson found himself wondering what Daisy was wearing. He'd increased her clothing allowance and given her the day off to prepare, but beyond that, he'd left the details to her. It was, after all, just a business arrangement. She would show up in something appropriate but unremarkable. They would make their appearance, and by Monday morning, life would return to normal. The doorbell of his penthouse chimed at exactly 7 o'clock, and Jackson checked his watch with approval. Whatever else could be said about Daisy, she was punctual to a fault. He strode across the marble floors of his living room, past the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased Seattle's glittering skyline, and opened the door with a polite smile already in place. The smile died on his lips. The woman standing in his doorway bore no resemblance to the dowdy assistant who had worked outside his office for 2 years. Gone were the oversized glasses, replaced by contacts that revealed eyes the color of warm chocolate, almond-shaped and lined with subtle kohl that made them appear enormous and mysterious. Her hair, freed from its usual severe bun, cascaded over her shoulders in glossy waves that caught the light like black silk. But it was the dress that stopped Jackson's heart entirely. She wore a gown of midnight blue that seemed to have been poured over her curves like liquid starlight. The dress was elegant rather than revealing, with a high neckline that skimmed her throat and long sleeves that hugged her arms, but every line of it whispered of hidden sensuality. It fell to the floor in a pool of silk that rustled when she moved, and when she turned slightly to adjust her small clutch, Jackson caught a glimpse of the dress's only concession to drama, a deep V that plunged nearly to the small of her back, revealing skin like polished mahogany. "Good evening, Mr. Rolland," Daisy said, her voice carrying the same professional tone she used in the office, though there was something different underneath it now. Confidence, perhaps. Or maybe challenge. Jackson realized he'd been staring for an embarrassingly long time and forced his mouth to close. "Daisy," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You look different." She smiled, and even that was transformed. Her usual careful professional expression had been replaced by something radiant and genuine that lit up her entire face. "Thank you. I hope this is appropriate for the occasion." Appropriate? Jackson nearly laughed at the understatement. She looked like a goddess who had decided to walk among mortals for her own amusement. Every man at the gala would want her, and every woman would either hate her or want to be her. "It's perfect," he said, finally remembering his manners. "Shall we go?" The ride in Jackson's Bentley was an exercise in carefully controlled tension. Daisy sat beside him in the leather seat, the silk of her dress whispering with every movement, her perfume, something sophisticated and intoxicating that he'd never smelled before, filling the confined space. Jackson found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting details he'd never bothered to observe before. The elegant line of her neck, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheekbones, the graceful way her hands rested in her lap. "I should probably warn you," he said as they neared the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. "There will be photographers, business press mostly, but they'll want pictures." "I understand," Daisy replied calmly. I've researched the guest list and familiarized myself with the major players who will be attending. I assume you'll want me to be charming, but not too memorable, professional, but not boring. Jackson turned to look at her fully, surprised by her thoroughness. You researched the guest list? Of course. This is important for your business relationships, isn't it? I would hardly attend without proper preparation. She smoothed her skirt with hands that betrayed no nervousness whatsoever. I've read up on current tech trends, market fluctuations, and recent merger activity. I can discuss artificial intelligence applications, cryptocurrency regulation, or sustainable energy innovations if necessary. For a moment, he was speechless. He'd invited her as arm candy, a beautiful prop to demonstrate his desirability to his colleagues. It had never occurred to him that she might approach the evening with the same intellectual rigor she brought to everything else. "Daisy," he began, then stopped, unsure what he wanted to say. The Bentley pulled up to the hotel's entrance, where a red carpet stretched beneath glittering lights, and photographers clustered like elegant vultures. Through the tinted windows, Jackson could see the parade of Seattle's elite making their grand entrances, designer gowns and expensive tuxedos, creating a river of wealth and ambition. "Mr. Rowland." Daisy's voice was gentle, and when he looked at her, he saw something that might have been concern in her eyes. "Are you ready?" Jackson took a deep breath, suddenly feeling like he was about to step into something far more complicated than he'd bargained for. "Let's do this." The hotel doorman opened Daisy's door first, and Jackson watched from inside the car as she emerged with fluid grace, the cameras immediately flashing as photographers tried to identify this stunning unknown woman. She paused for just a moment, allowing them to capture her image, then waited patiently for Jackson to join her. When he stepped out and offered her his arm, the reaction was immediate and electric. Whispers rippled through the crowd of onlookers and media representatives as they tried to place the beautiful woman on Jackson Rowland's arm. Jackson felt a surge of pride and possession that surprised him with its intensity. "Jackson," a photographer called out, "who's your lovely companion?" "This is Ms. Daisy Renton," Jackson replied smoothly, his hand warm on her back as he guided her toward the entrance. "My partner for the evening." Partner. The word slipped out before he could stop it, and he felt Daisy's slight hesitation in her step. He'd meant to say date, or even just friend, but somehow partner felt more accurate, more honest. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic had been transformed into a technological wonderland for the evening. Holographic displays showcased the latest innovations from Seattle's tech community, while servers in sleek uniforms circulated with champagne and canapes. The city's business elite clustered in groups, their conversations a mixture of social pleasantries and multi-million-dollar negotiations. Jackson guided Daisy through the crowd, introducing her to colleagues and clients with growing amazement at her performance. She was charming without being flirtatious, intelligent without being intimidating, and somehow managed to make each person feel as though they were the most interesting individual in the room. "Ms. Renton," Mayor Patricia Vaughn extended her hand with genuine warmth. "I understand you work in the technology sector." "I'm in business development," Daisy replied smoothly, accepting the handshake with perfect poise. "It's fascinating work, especially with all the innovations happening in sustainable tech right now. I imagine the city is exploring quite a few green energy initiatives." As Daisy and the mayor launched into an intelligent discussion about municipal renewable energy programs, Jackson found himself watching her with growing fascination. This wasn't the quiet, invisible assistant who managed his schedule and answered his phones. This was a woman of substance, wit, and undeniable charisma who had somehow been hiding in plain sight. "My God, Jackson," a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Blake Ashworth approaching, his rival's pale blue eyes fixed hungrily on Daisy. "Where have you been hiding this absolute vision?" Blake was everything Jackson despised about their industry. Old money pretending to be new tech, inherited wealth masquerading as earned success. At 35, he ran Ashworth Digital with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for failure. He was also devastatingly handsome in a classical way that attracted women like moths to flame, and had been nursing a grudge against Jackson ever since losing a major government contract to Rawlent Industries the previous year. "Blake," Jackson's voice carried a warning edge, "I'd like you to meet Daisy Renton." Blake took Daisy's hand and brought it halfway to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that made Jackson's jaw clench. "Ms. Renton, you are absolutely radiant. Would you honor me with a dance?" Daisy glanced at Jackson, and for a moment he saw something flicker in her expression. Was she asking permission, or was she testing him? "I'd be delighted," she said finally, allowing Blake to lead her onto the dance floor. Jackson watched as Blake pulled Daisy into his arms, his hands positioned with perfect propriety but his smile carrying unmistakable intent. They moved together beautifully, Daisy's grace evident in every step, her laugh carrying across the ballroom as Blake whispered something undoubtedly charming in her ear. For the first time in his adult life, Jackson Rawlent experienced pure, unadulterated jealousy. It hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands clench into fists. The sight of another man's hands on Daisy, another man making her smile, another man being the focus of her attention, it was unbearable. "She's quite lovely." Nathaniel Cross appeared at Jackson's elbow, his voice carrying smug satisfaction. "Though I have to say I'm surprised you chose someone so accessible. Usually your companions are a bit more exclusive." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Nathaniel was suggesting that Daisy was somehow beneath Jackson's usual standards, that she was common rather than exceptional. The comment ignited something dangerous in Jackson's chest. "Careful, Nathaniel." Jackson's voice was deadly quiet. "You're talking about my date." On the dance floor, Blake was leaning closer to Daisy, his lips near her ear as he said something that made her throw back her head and laugh with genuine delight. The sound hit Jackson like a punch to the solar plexus. He couldn't take any more. Jackson strode onto the dance floor with the single-minded determination of a man claiming what was his. Blake looked up as he approached, his smile faltering at whatever he saw in Jackson's expression. "Mind if I cut in?" Jackson asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. Blake's arms loosened reluctantly around Daisy. "Of course. Ms. Renton, thank you for the lovely dance. I do hope we'll have another opportunity later." As Blake retreated, Jackson pulled Daisy into his arms and immediately felt the rightness of it. She fit against him perfectly, her hand warm in his, her body moving in perfect synchronization with his own. The jealousy that had been eating at him like acid began to fade, replaced by something deeper and infinitely more dangerous. "Having fun?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Daisy looked up at him, her eyes unreadable in the ballroom's romantic lighting. "It's been enlightening." "How so?" She was quiet for a moment, and Jackson found himself holding his breath as he waited for her answer. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but filled with something that might have been disappointment. "I think I'm beginning to understand why you invited me tonight." The statement hit Jackson like cold water, washing away the warmth of holding her and replacing it with sharp awareness of his own motivations. She was right, of course. He had invited her to prove a point, to demonstrate his desirability and power to colleagues who had questioned his romantic capabilities. But looking down at her now, seeing the intelligence and dignity and quiet strength that he'd been too blind to notice before, Jackson realized that somewhere during the evening, his motivations had shifted entirely. He was no longer thinking about Nathaniel and Williams, no longer concerned with proving anything to anyone else. All he could think about was the woman in his arms, the way her skin glowed in the candlelight, the way her laugh had made him feel when Blake had earned it, the way she was looking at him now with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Daisy," he began, but she shook her head slightly. "It's all right, Jackson. I understand what this is." But as they continued to dance, as Jackson felt the warmth of her body against his and breathed in the intoxicating scent of her perfume, he realized that he didn't understand what this was at all. What had started as a calculated move in a game of corporate politics had become something else entirely, something that made his chest tight and his hands shake and his carefully ordered world tilt on its axis. The song ended, but Jackson didn't let her go. They stood there in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by Seattle's elite, but aware only of each other, while something fundamental shifted between them. Jackson Rowland was falling, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to stop. Chapter 3. The Awakening. The rest of the Pinnacle Awards gala passed in a blur of champagne toasts, industry speeches, and carefully orchestrated networking, but Jackson Rowland was aware of nothing beyond the woman at his side. Daisy had transformed from invisible assistant to the undisputed queen of the evening, and Jackson found himself mesmerized by this revelation of her true self. She moved through conversations with the grace of a diplomat, discussing quantum computing advances with tech CEOs, debating environmental policy with government officials, and somehow making the mayor's notoriously difficult wife laugh until tears ran down her cheeks. "Your Ms. Renton is quite remarkable," Senator Elizabeth Hayes commented as they watched Daisy expertly navigate a discussion about cybersecurity legislation with a group of defense contractors. "Where on earth did you find her?" Jackson's response died in his throat as he realized the truth. He hadn't found Daisy at all. She had been right there beside him for 2 years, managing his life with quiet competence, while he remained completely oblivious to her brilliance. The thought made him feel like the worst kind of fool. "She's been with my company for some time," he replied carefully, his eyes never leaving Daisy's animated face as she made a point about encryption protocols. "Though I'm beginning to realize I've never given her the recognition she deserves." The senator raised an eyebrow at the admission, but before she could respond, Blake Ashworth materialized at Jackson's elbow like a persistent shadow. "Jackson, old friend." Blake's smile was all teeth and predatory charm. "I hope you won't mind if I steal Miss Renton for another dance. We were having such a fascinating conversation about artificial intelligence applications in financial markets." Jackson's jaw clenched involuntarily. Throughout the evening, Blake had circled Daisy like a shark, scenting blood, finding excuses to approach her whenever Jackson's attention was diverted by business conversations. Each interaction had been perfectly polite and professional, but Jackson could read the hunger in Blake's eyes as clearly as a neon sign. "Actually," Jackson stepped closer to Daisy, his hand settling possessively on the small of her back, where her dress revealed warm, smooth skin. "I was hoping to get some air. Daisy, would you join me on the terrace?" Daisy looked between the two men, and Jackson saw her taking in the subtle tension crackling between them. Her lips curved in what might have been amusement, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "That sounds lovely," she said, accepting Jackson's offered arm. "Mr. Ashworth, perhaps we can continue our discussion another time." Blake's smile never wavered, but Jackson caught the flash of irritation in his pale eyes. "Of course, I'll look forward to it." The hotel's terrace overlooked Elliott Bay, where the lights of distant ferries moved across dark water like fallen stars. The November air was crisp but not unpleasant, carrying the salt scent of the Sound and the distant sound of traffic from the streets below. Most of the gala attendees had remained inside where it was warm, leaving Jackson and Daisy virtually alone among the elegant outdoor furniture and carefully maintained garden spaces. Beautiful night, Daisy commented, moving to the stone railing that bordered the terrace. The city lights reflected in her dark eyes, and the breeze stirred her hair in a way that made Jackson's chest tight. Yes, he agreed, though he wasn't looking at the view. Daisy, I owe you an apology. She turned to face him, surprise flickering across her features. For what? Jackson struggled to find words for the realization that had been building throughout the evening. For not seeing you. For treating you like office furniture instead of recognizing the extraordinary woman you are. A shadow crossed Daisy's face, and she looked away from him, back toward the sparkling cityscape. Is that what this evening has been about? You finally noticing that your assistant cleans up well? The question stung because it was partially true, but Jackson realized that his motivations had evolved far beyond his original shallow intentions. It started that way, he admitted with painful honesty, when Nathaniel and Williams questioned my ability to attract an exceptional woman. Inviting you seemed like an easy way to prove them wrong. Daisy's shoulders stiffened, and Jackson saw hurt flash across her expression before she carefully schooled her features back to neutrality. I see. Well, I hope I've been an adequate prop for your ego tonight. Damn it, no. Jackson moved closer, his voice urgent. That's not what I mean. Yes, I invited you to make a point, but Daisy, watching you tonight, seeing how brilliant and gracious and captivating you are, I realize I've been a blind idiot for 2 years. She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Jackson, you don't have to flatter me. I understand exactly what this is. You needed a presentable woman for an important business function, and I happened to be convenient. I dressed the part, played my role, and tomorrow we'll go back to our normal professional relationship where you bark orders and I follow them. The casual dismissal of what he was feeling hit Jackson like a physical blow. He reached out without thinking, his hands settling gently on her bare shoulders, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his palms. Look at me, he said softly, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. I'm not flattering you. I'm trying to apologize for being too arrogant and stupid to see what was right in front of me. You're not convenient, Daisy. You're extraordinary. Something flickered in her eyes. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just confusion. Jackson, Blake Ashworth isn't wrong to pursue you, Jackson continued, his thumbs unconsciously stroking along her collarbones. Any man would be a fool not to see how remarkable you are, but the thought of him touching you, making you laugh, being the one who gets to see you smile, it's driving me insane. Daisy's breath caught, and Jackson felt the slight tremor that ran through her body at his words. You're jealous? Completely, he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. Irrationally, possessively jealous in a way I've never experienced before. When I saw you dancing with him, laughing at his jokes, I wanted to throw him off the terrace. A smile tugged at the corners of Daisy's mouth, despite her obvious efforts to maintain her composure. That would have caused quite a scandal. Worth it, Jackson said immediately, and meant it. Daisy, I know I have no right to ask this after the way I've treated you, but please, don't write this off as just business. Don't write me off. She studied his face in the soft light from the ballroom, searching for something Jackson desperately hoped she would find. What are you asking me? Jackson realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. He could retreat now, maintain the professional distance that had defined their relationship, and pretend this evening had been nothing more than a successful business arrangement. Or he could step forward into unknown territory and risk everything he thought he understood about himself. I'm asking for a chance, he said finally. A real chance, not as your boss or as someone who needs arm candy for corporate events, but as a man who's realized he's been falling for his assistant and was too much of an arrogant ass to recognize it. Daisy's eyes widened, and for a moment, Jackson saw his own vulnerability reflected back at him. Then her expression softened into something that made his heart race. "Jackson," she whispered, and the way she said his name, not Mr. Rowland, not Sir, but his actual name spoken with warmth and possibility, made him feel like he could conquer the world. He leaned closer, drawn by forces beyond his control, and saw her eyelashes flutter as she tilted her face up toward his. The space between them seemed charged with electricity, heavy with 2 years of unspoken tension, and the revelation of feelings neither had acknowledged until tonight. Jackson's hand moved to cup her face, his thumb tracing the elegant line of her cheekbone. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, giving her one last chance to preserve the boundaries between them. Instead, Daisy rose on her tiptoes, closing the remaining distance between them with decision that took his breath away. Their first kiss was soft, tentative, a question asked and answered in the space of a heartbeat. Then Jackson's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of desperate longing and newfound understanding. Daisy's hands fisted in the lapels of his tuxedo, anchoring herself as the world tilted around them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers and tried to make sense of the emotions coursing through him. "Daisy," he began, but she placed a finger against his lips. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't say anything that will make this complicated. Not tonight." Jackson caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that made her shiver. "It's already complicated." "I know." She pulled back slightly, studying his face with eyes that held a mixture of hope and wariness. "Jackson, I need you to understand something. I'm not some starry-eyed assistant who's been harboring secret fantasies about her boss. If you're looking for someone who'll be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you're willing to throw her way, you're looking at the wrong woman." The statement was delivered with quiet dignity, but Jackson heard the unshakable strength beneath her gentle tone. This wasn't the invisible, compliant assistant he'd taken for granted. This was a woman who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. "Good," he said, surprising her. "I don't want grateful or easy. I want you, all of you, exactly as you are." A smile finally broke across Daisy's face, transforming her features with radiant warmth. "Then you'd better be prepared for a challenge, Mr. Rowland, because I intend to make you work for it." Jackson laughed, the sound rich with anticipation and joy. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The sound of applause from inside the ballroom reminded them that the evening was drawing to a close, that the real world waited just beyond the magical bubble they'd created on the terrace. But as Jackson offered Daisy his arm and they walked back toward the warmth and light of the gala, he felt like everything in his life had just shifted into perfect focus. For the first time in his 32 years, Jackson Rowland was truly, deeply, helplessly in love. And the woman beside him, brilliant, beautiful, challenging Daisy Renton, just might be willing to give him the chance to prove he was worthy of her affection. The game had indeed changed, but Jackson was beginning to realize that what he'd thought was a game had actually been the beginning of the rest of his life. Chapter 4. The Pursuit. The weekend after the Pinnacle Awards Gala arrived with the brutal efficiency of a corporate takeover, and Jackson Rowland found himself standing in his office early Monday morning, holding a cup of premium Ethiopian coffee and staring at the door to his assistant's workspace like a teenager working up the courage to ask someone to prom. 3 days had passed since the Pinnacle Awards Gala. 3 days since that earth-shattering kiss on the terrace, and Jackson had spent every waking moment replaying the evening in his mind. The feel of Daisy in his arms, the way she'd looked at him with those intelligent dark eyes, the soft warmth of her lips against his. It had consumed his thoughts to the point where he'd barely been able to focus on the most basic business decisions. The drive home from the gala had been charged with unspoken tension and possibility. They'd sat in comfortable silence, Daisy's hand resting in his on the leather seat between them, both seeming to understand that whatever had begun between them needed time to breathe before being examined too closely. When he'd walked her to her apartment door, the goodnight kiss had been sweet and restrained, but it had left Jackson lying awake until dawn, burning with want and something deeper that he was only beginning to recognize. Now, as he waited for Daisy to arrive for their first day back in the office, Jackson felt like he was about to take the most important meeting of his life. The soft chime of the elevator preceded her entrance by exactly 30 seconds. Jackson had learned her patterns well enough to know that she always took precisely that long to walk from the elevator to their suite. But when the outer office door opened and Daisy stepped inside, Jackson's carefully prepared speech died in his throat. She was back in her professional armor, the conservative navy suit, the sensible low heels, the severe bun that tamed her glorious hair into submission. Only the subtle confidence in her bearing and the way she met his gaze directly, instead of deferentially, indicated that anything had changed between them. "Good morning, Mr. Rowland," she said in her perfectly professional tone, settling behind her desk with practiced efficiency. "Your 8 a.m. with the Korean delegation has been moved to 8:30 due to traffic delays from the airport. I've rescheduled your other meetings accordingly, and the Patterson contract is ready for your review. Mr. Rowland." After everything that had passed between them, she was back to the formal address that reminded him of the professional boundary he'd spent 2 years maintaining with ruthless efficiency. Jackson felt something cold settle in his stomach as he wondered if Daisy had decided to pretend the gala had never happened. "Daisy," he said carefully, then caught himself. In the office, she had always been Ms. Renton, but after holding her in his arms, after kissing her until they were both breathless, the formal address felt like a betrayal of what had grown between them. She looked up from her computer screen, one elegant eyebrow raised in inquiry. "Yes, sir?" Jackson studied her face, searching for some sign of the woman who had smiled at him under the stars, who had challenged him to work for her affection, who had kissed him with a passion that had rearranged his understanding of what was possible between two people. But Daisy's expression remained politely professional, giving nothing away. "I was hoping we could discuss what happened at the gala," he said finally, his voice carrying more uncertainty than he was comfortable with. "Of course," Daisy replied smoothly. "I believe the evening was quite successful from a business perspective. You made several valuable connections, and the preliminary feedback I've received suggests that your presence with a sophisticated companion helped solidify your reputation among your peers." The clinical assessment of their evening together hit Jackson like a slap. Sophisticated companion, as if she were nothing more than a hired escort who had performed her duties adequately. "That's not what I meant," Jackson said, his voice sharpening with frustration. "I'm aware of what you meant." Daisy's tone remained perfectly level, but Jackson caught a flicker of something. Hurt, wariness, in her eyes. "However, I think it would be best if we maintained our professional relationship. What happened at the gala was pleasant, but it would be inappropriate to let personal feelings interfere with our work environment." Pleasant. Jackson felt his temper spike at the dismissive word. What had happened between them had been earth-shattering, life-changing, the beginning of something he'd never experienced before. And she was calling it pleasant. "Is that what you really want?" he asked, moving closer to her desk. "To pretend that nothing happened between us?" Daisy's fingers stilled on her keyboard, and for a moment Jackson saw her careful composure crack. When she looked up at him, her eyes held a vulnerability that made his chest ache. "What I want," she said quietly, "and what's realistic are two very different things. You're Jackson Rowland. You date supermodels and socialites, women who move in your world naturally. I'm your assistant who had one magical evening playing dress-up. Let's not complicate things by pretending it was anything more." The words were like a knife to Jackson's heart, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how little Daisy believed in her own worth, how little she believed in his capacity to see beyond the shallow expectations his past behavior had created. "You're wrong," he said fiercely, "about all of it, but especially about yourself." Before Daisy could respond, the office door burst open, and Nathaniel Cross strode in with his usual lack of regard for boundaries or appointments. "Jackson, my boy," Nathaniel boomed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd been proven right. "Heard through the grapevine that your little performance at the gala was quite the success. Managed to fool everyone into thinking you could actually attract a quality woman." Jackson's hands clenched into fists at the insult, but before he could respond, Nathaniel had turned his attention to Daisy, with the predatory interest of a man who enjoyed exercising power over those he considered beneath him. "Miss Renton, isn't it? I must say you cleaned up remarkably well for the evening, though I imagine it must have been quite overwhelming being thrust into such elevated company." Daisy's spine straightened, and Jackson saw steel flash in her eyes. "Not at all, Mr. Cross. I found the conversation quite stimulating. Your wife's insights into art acquisition were particularly enlightening." Nathaniel's smile faltered slightly at the smooth deflection, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, well, I'm sure it was all very educational for you. Still, I hope you don't harbor any illusions about your little Cinderella moment. Jackson's tastes tend to run toward more sophisticated women in the long term." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. Jackson saw Daisy flinch almost imperceptibly, and something dark and dangerous unfurled in his chest. "Get out!" Jackson's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried enough menace to make Nathaniel step back. "I beg your pardon? I said get out of my office. Now, before I have security escort you out and make sure everyone in this building knows exactly what kind of man you are." Nathaniel's face flushed red with indignation. "Jackson, surely you're not going to let your little dalliance with the help cloud your judgment about important business relationships." "One more word," Jackson interrupted, his voice carrying the promise of violence. "And you'll be explaining to your investors why Rawlent Industries just canceled every contract we have with your company. Get out." The threat hit its mark. Nathaniel's company depended heavily on the lucrative contracts with Rawlent Industries, and losing them would be catastrophic. After a moment of sputtering outrage, he turned and stalked out of the office, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Jackson turned to find Daisy staring at him with wide eyes, something like wonder mixed with confusion in her expression. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did." Jackson moved around her desk, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Daisy, I need you to understand something. What Nathaniel said, what he implied, none of it is true. You're not the help, you're not a dalliance, and you sure as hell aren't beneath anyone in this building or any other." Tears gathered in Daisy's eyes, though she blinked them back with characteristic strength. "Jackson, I'm not finished," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "You want to know what I really want? I want to take you to lunch at the most expensive restaurant in the city. I want to hold your hand while we walk through Pike Place Market. I want to spend hours talking to you about everything and nothing, learning all the things about you that I was too blind to see before." Daisy's breath caught, and Jackson saw the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. "I want to bring you coffee every morning," he continued, his thumbs stroking over her knuckles. "Not because you're my assistant, but because I love the way you smile when you take that first sip. I want to ask your opinion about business decisions because your mind is the sharpest I've ever encountered. I want to come home to you at the end of every day and fall asleep holding you in my arms." A single tear escaped to track down Daisy's cheek, and Jackson reached up to catch it with gentle fingers. "But mostly," he whispered, "I want you to believe that you deserve all of that, and more. Because you do, Daisy. You deserve everything." For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the distant hum of the city 42 floors below. Then Daisy smiled, really smiled, with the radiance that had taken his breath away at the gala. "Lunch sounds nice," she said quietly, "though I should probably warn you that I have very strong opinions about seafood preparation." Jackson laughed, the sound rich with relief and joy. "I wouldn't expect anything less. But first, I believe I owe you a proper cup of coffee." As he stood to fulfill that promise, Jackson caught sight of the city skyline through his office windows. Seattle stretched out before them in all its rain-washed glory, full of possibility and promise. And for the first time in his life, Jackson Rowland felt like he was exactly where he belonged, pursuing the most remarkable woman he'd ever met, ready to prove that he was worthy of her love. The chase was on, and Jackson intended to win not through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but by showing Daisy every day that she was the most precious thing in his world. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The emergency that shattered Jackson. Rowland's carefully ordered world arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night in the form of a phone call that would have destroyed most companies and bankrupted lesser men. Jackson had been lying in bed in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Daisy, something that had become his primary occupation over the past 3 weeks. Their relationship had evolved into something beautiful and terrifying, a careful dance of professional boundaries and personal intimacy that left him constantly off balance and more alive than he'd ever felt. They'd had lunch at that expensive restaurant, where Daisy had indeed expressed strong opinions about the chef's heavy-handed approach to salmon preparation. They'd walked through Pike Place Market, her hand warm in his as she'd pointed out her favorite vendors, and convinced him to try a dozen different samples of artisanal honey. They'd spent hours in his office after business hours, ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports, but actually talking about everything from her childhood in New Orleans to his complicated relationship with his late father. But they'd been careful, so careful, to maintain propriety during business hours. Daisy still called him Mr. Rowland in front of others, still maintained the professional demeanor that had defined their working relationship, and Jackson had respected her wishes, even as it killed him to pretend that the woman he was falling deeper in love with each day was nothing more than his very competent assistant. The phone rang with the harsh insistence of disaster, and Jackson answered without checking the caller ID. "Rowland." Jackson, thank God. The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, Rowland Industries' chief technology officer, and it carried the kind of panic that Jackson had learned to associate with catastrophic system failures. "We've got a problem. A big one." Jackson sat up, instantly alert. "Talk to me." "The Yamamoto deal. Someone hacked our servers and stole the proprietary code for the new AI framework. Not only that, but they've leaked it to our 3 biggest competitors. The contract signing is supposed to happen in 6 hours, and if Yamamoto Industries finds out we've been compromised..." Jackson closed his eyes, feeling the weight of potential disaster settling on his shoulders. The Yamamoto deal was worth $400 million and represented Rowland Industries' entry into the lucrative Asian technology market. Losing it wouldn't bankrupt the company, but it would be a devastating blow that would take years to recover from. "How bad is the leak?" Jackson asked, already reaching for his clothes. "Complete system penetration. They got everything: source code, financial projections, strategic plans, client lists. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for." Jackson's jaw clenched as the implications hit him. This wasn't random corporate espionage. This was targeted, surgical, and timed for maximum damage. Someone with intimate knowledge of Rowland Industries' operations had orchestrated this attack. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Jackson said, ending the call and grabbing his keys. The Rowland Tower at midnight was a monument to ambition and insomnia, its lower floors dark while the upper executive levels blazed with emergency lighting. Jackson's private elevator carried him to the 42nd floor, where he found chaos barely contained by corporate professionalism. Marcus Webb looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled from stress. "Jackson, I've got the whole security team working on damage control, But? Jackson prompted, though he could read the answer in Marcus's defeated expression. "It's too late. The leak has already reached Ashworth Digital, Pinnacle Tech, and Morrison Industries. They're all scrambling to present competing offers to Yamamoto based on our stolen designs." Blake Ashworth. Jackson should have known his rival would be involved somehow, but even Blake wasn't foolish enough to orchestrate something this blatant without ironclad deniability. "Sir," a voice from the outer office interrupted Jackson's thoughts, and he turned to find one of the night security guards looking apologetic but determined. "I tried to stop her, but she said you'd want to see her immediately." Before Jackson could ask who she was, Daisy appeared in the doorway, and Jackson's heart stopped. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders and her face free of makeup. She looked younger, softer, and more beautiful than any woman had a right to look at midnight on a Tuesday. "What are you doing here?" Jackson asked, moving toward her instinctively. "Marcus called me," Daisy replied, her eyes already scanning the chaos of printouts, laptops, and stress-fueled coffee cups that littered the office. "He said there was a security breach involving the Yamamoto contract." Jackson turned to glare at his CTO. "You called my assistant at midnight." "She's the one who wrote half the proposal," Marcus said defensively. "And she knows our security protocols better than anyone except the IT department. I figured we needed all hands on deck." The admission hit Jackson like a physical blow. Daisy had been instrumental in the Yamamoto proposal. He'd known she was brilliant, had watched her handle complex negotiations and strategic planning with remarkable skill, but somehow he'd never connected her daily contributions to the larger victories he'd been claiming credit for. "The technical specifications and market analysis sections," Daisy continued, already moving toward one of the computers. "You handled the financial negotiations and executive presentations." Jackson felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. For months he'd been taking credit for a proposal that Daisy had largely created. Not only had he been blind to her personal worth, but he'd been professionally exploiting her genius without even realizing it. "Daisy," he began, but she was already deep in concentration, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up files and cross-referenced security logs. "The breach originated from an internal access point," she announced after several minutes of intense focus. "Someone with high-level clearance uploaded a Trojan virus that created a backdoor into our most secure servers." "That's impossible," Marcus protested. "Only 5 people have access to those systems." Daisy's face was grim as she continued typing. 6 people, actually. You, Jackson, myself, Director Thompson from Legal, CFO Patricia Wells, and Blake Ashworth. The silence that followed was deafening. Blake Ashworth had been granted temporary access to certain Rowland Industries systems as part of a joint venture proposal that had ultimately been abandoned. The access should have been revoked months ago, but in the chaos of rapid corporate expansion, it had apparently slipped through the cracks. "That son of a bitch," Jackson breathed, his hands clenching into fists. "He's been planning this for months." "There's more," Daisy said quietly, her voice carrying a note that made Jackson's blood run cold. "The breach happened at 3:17 a.m. on Monday, but the file access logs show that someone downloaded the complete Yamamoto proposal at 11:43 p.m. on Sunday night." Jackson felt the implications hit him like a freight train. "Monday night was when we had dinner at Castelli's. We were together until almost midnight. Which means, Daisy's voice was barely above a whisper, that whoever did this knew exactly when you would be out of the office and unable to respond to security alerts. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Everyone in the room was looking at Daisy now, and Jackson could see the suspicion dawning in their faces. She was the only one who had known about his dinner plans. She was the only one who had been alone in the office that night after he left. "You think I did this?" Daisy's voice was steady, but Jackson could see the hurt and betrayal in her eyes as she looked around the room. "Well," Marcus said carefully, "you did have access to everything they stole, and you've been close to Jackson lately. Maybe Blake offered you something we couldn't match." "That's enough," Jackson's voice cut through the speculation like a blade. "Daisy didn't do this." "Jackson," Marcus said gently, "I know you care about her, but we have to consider all possibilities. The evidence is circumstantial bullshit," Jackson snapped. "Daisy has been working 18-hour days for 2 years making this company successful. She saved us more money and prevented more disasters than any of you could even calculate. The idea that she would sabotage everything she's built is absurd." But even as he defended her, Jackson could see doubt creeping into the faces around him. The timing was suspicious, the access undeniable, and Daisy's recent relationship with Jackson provided potential motive for those inclined to conspiracy theories. "I need to call my contact at Yamamoto Industries," Daisy said quietly, moving away from the computer. "If we're going to salvage this deal, we need to get ahead of the story." "No," Marcus stepped in front of her. "I think it would be better if you stayed away from client communications until we sort this out." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus was treating Daisy like a suspect, and the rest of the team was following his lead. Jackson felt rage building in his chest, but before he could respond, Daisy spoke with quiet dignity. "Of course, I understand." She turned to Jackson, and the hurt in her eyes made his heart break. "I'll be at my desk if you need anything else." As Daisy walked out of the office, her spine straight and her head held high, despite the suspicion surrounding her, Jackson felt something fundamental shift inside him. The woman he loved was being treated like a criminal by people who owed their success to her brilliance, and he was the only one who seemed to see the injustice of it. "Get back to work," Jackson told the room at large. "All of you. Find out how Blake got access to our systems and build me a timeline of exactly what was stolen and when." As the team dispersed to their various tasks, Jackson followed Daisy to her desk in the outer office. She was sitting in her chair, staring at her dark computer screen with an expression of profound sadness. "They think I betrayed you," she said without looking up. Jackson knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his, just as he had weeks ago when he'd first tried to show her how much she meant to him. "I don't care what they think. I know who you are. Do you?" Daisy's eyes met his, and Jackson saw vulnerability there that made his chest ache. "Because right now I feel like I don't know anything anymore. I feel like I've been living in a dream where I was more than just your assistant, where what we had was real and important and worth fighting for." "It is real," Jackson said fiercely. "What we have is the most real thing in my life." Daisy smiled sadly. "Then why does it feel like it's falling apart?" Jackson didn't have an answer for that, so instead, he did the only thing he could. He pulled her into his arms and held her while the city slept around them, and the crisis that would define their future continued to unfold. Whatever happened next, whatever damage Blake Ashworth's sabotage ultimately caused, Jackson knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would protect Daisy Renton with everything he had, even if it cost him his company and his reputation. Because somewhere between the first cup of coffee he'd brought her and this moment of quiet desperation in his office at 2 a.m., Daisy had stopped being his assistant and become his heart. And Jackson Rowland would be damned if he'd let anyone destroy that without a fight. Chapter 6. The First Kiss. 2 weeks after the Yamamoto crisis had been resolved, salvaged through Daisy's brilliant damage control and Jackson's ruthless legal maneuvering against Blake Ashworth, Jackson found himself staring out the window of a luxury SUV as it wound through the rolling hills of Napa Valley, wondering how he'd let himself be talked into a corporate retreat. The team needs this, Daisy had argued when she'd presented the proposal for a weekend getaway designed to rebuild morale and trust after the security breach. Everyone's been working around the clock. Tensions are high, and, frankly, some people still have doubts about what really happened that night. She hadn't said that some people still suspected her of corporate espionage, but Jackson had heard it in the careful neutrality of her tone. The official investigation had cleared her completely. Security footage and digital forensics had proven that Blake Ashworth had indeed orchestrated the attack using his overlooked system access. But workplace rumors were harder to kill than cockroaches, and Jackson knew that Daisy still felt the sting of her colleagues' suspicion. Now, as their convoy of vehicles approached the Auberge du Soleil resort, Jackson caught sight of Daisy in the passenger seat of the lead car through the windshield. She was laughing at something their CFO had said, her face animated with genuine joy for the first time in weeks. The sight made his chest tight with emotions he was still learning to name. The resort was everything Jackson had expected from Daisy's impeccable planning. Elegant without being ostentatious, sophisticated enough to impress his executives, but intimate enough to encourage the team bonding she was hoping to achieve. Their suites were scattered throughout the property, connected by winding paths through olive groves and lavender fields that perfumed the October air. "Mr. Rowland," the resort manager approached as Jackson climbed out of his vehicle. "I'm terribly sorry, but there's been an issue with the room assignments. We had a last-minute cancellation from another corporate group, and their suite had a plumbing emergency. We're one room short for your party." Jackson felt his jaw clench. Trust a luxury resort to have plumbing problems when he needed everything to go smoothly. "What are our options?" "Well, we do have one solution," the manager said carefully. "Our vintage suite has 2 bedrooms with a shared living area. It's quite spacious, and the accommodations are our finest. If 2 members of your party wouldn't mind sharing the common space." Before Jackson could respond, Daisy appeared at his elbow, having overheard the conversation. "That would be fine," she said with professional efficiency. "Mr. Rowland and I can share the suite. We often work late on business matters, so the shared space would actually be convenient." The casual way she'd volunteered to share accommodations with him sent heat shooting through Jackson's veins. Though her tone suggested she viewed it as nothing more than a practical business arrangement, which, he reminded himself, was exactly how he should be viewing it as well. "Perfect," the manager beamed with relief. "I'll have your luggage sent up immediately." As the rest of the team scattered to their rooms to freshen up before the evening's wine tasting, Jackson found himself alone with Daisy for the first time since the crisis 2 weeks ago. Their relationship had been carefully professional since then, both of them seemingly determined to prove that their personal feelings wouldn't interfere with business operations. "You don't have to do this," Jackson said as they walked toward their suite. "I can sleep in the living room, or we can ask someone else to share accommodations." Daisy glanced at him with amusement. "Jackson, we're both adults. I think we can manage to share a suite for 2 nights without the world ending." The vintage suite was, as promised, spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the valley, where rolling hills covered in autumn vines stretched toward distant mountains. The living area was appointed with comfortable leather furniture and a stone fireplace, while French doors opened onto a private terrace complete with a hot tub that steamed invitingly in the evening air. "This is beautiful," Daisy breathed, moving to the windows to take in the view. The setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, and the light turned her skin luminous. Jackson watched her instead of the scenery, noting the way the light caught in her hair and the graceful curve of her neck as she tilted her head to see the mountains in the distance. Beautiful, he agreed, though he wasn't talking about the landscape. The wine tasting that evening was held in the resort's private cellar, where tables had been arranged among the oak barrels and stone archways. Jackson's team relaxed as the excellent vintages worked their magic, conversations becoming more animated and laughter more frequent as the evening progressed. Jackson found himself seated across from Daisy, watching as she charmed the sommelier with intelligent questions about terroir and fermentation techniques. She'd changed into a flowing burgundy dress that complemented the wine country setting, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Ms. Renton clearly has an appreciation for fine wine," commented Patricia Wells, their CFO, as Daisy correctly identified notes of blackcurrant and tobacco in a particularly complex Cabernet. "I spent a summer in France during college," Daisy explained, swirling her glass with practiced ease, "working harvest at a vineyard in Bordeaux. It was supposed to be a cultural exchange program, but I ended up learning more about wine production than French literature." He felt a familiar pang at the realization that there were still so many things he didn't know about the woman he was falling deeper in love with each day. Every conversation revealed new depths to her intelligence and experience, reminders of how much of her life he'd ignored during their years of working together. "You never mentioned that," he said, aware that his colleagues were watching their interaction with interest. Daisy's smile was carefully neutral. "There are a lot of things about me you don't know, Mr. Rowland." The formal address stung, especially since they were supposed to be relaxing and getting to know each other better as a team. But Jackson understood her caution. Their colleagues were still watching for signs of favoritism or impropriety, still judging whether Daisy's recent prominence in company operations was due to her abilities or her relationship with their boss. As the evening wound down and the team began to drift back to their rooms, Jackson found himself walking beside Daisy along the moonlit path to their suite. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfumed with the scent of eucalyptus and the distant smoke from someone's fireplace. "Thank you," Daisy said suddenly, her voice soft in the darkness. "For what?" "For defending me during the crisis, for never doubting me, even when the evidence looked suspicious." She paused, then added more quietly, "For believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." Jackson stopped walking, turning to face her in the dappled moonlight filtering through the olive trees. "Daisy, you saved that deal. If you hadn't figured out Blake's involvement and contacted Yamamoto Industries directly to explain the situation, we would have lost everything." "We would have lost everything," she corrected. "This company means as much to me as it does to you, Jackson. Maybe more, because I've had to fight for every opportunity, every moment of recognition." The quiet pain in her voice made Jackson's chest ache. He reached out without thinking, his fingers ghosting along her cheek in a touch so light it might have been imagined. "You shouldn't have had to fight so hard," he said. "I should have seen your worth from the beginning." Daisy leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before opening to meet his gaze. "We can't change the past." "No," Jackson agreed, stepping closer until he could smell her perfume, until he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "But we can choose what happens next." The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility and danger. They were alone in the moonlight, away from the office and the careful boundaries they'd maintained, surrounded by the intoxicating beauty of wine country and the lingering effects of excellent vintage. "Jackson," Daisy whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer and a warning combined. "I know we agreed to keep things professional," he said, his voice rough with want and uncertainty. "I know all the reasons why this is complicated. But Daisy, I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is simple or containable or appropriate." She searched his face in the moonlight, and Jackson held his breath as he waited for her response. He was balanced on a knife's edge between hope and heartbreak, between the safe distance they'd maintained and the terrifying intimacy he craved. "What do you feel for me?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of wind through the vines. Jackson cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs tracing the elegant line of her cheekbones. "I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my life until I met you. I feel like every success I've achieved means nothing without someone to share it with. I feel like you've become the center of my world without me even noticing it happening." Tears gathered in Daisy's eyes, though she didn't let them fall. "That's a lot of feeling for someone you barely noticed for 2 years." "I noticed," Jackson admitted with painful honesty. "I noticed how brilliant you were, how graceful, how you made everything in my life run smoothly. I just convinced myself that acknowledging it would complicate things. I was a coward who hid behind professional boundaries because I was terrified of what you made me feel. And now—" Daisy's hands came up to rest against his chest, her palms warm through the fabric of his shirt. "Now I'm still terrified," Jackson said with a laugh that held no humor. "But I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of facing what's between us." Daisy rose on her tiptoes, eliminating the last inches of distance between them. "Then stop being afraid," she whispered against his lips. Their first real kiss was nothing like the sweet, tentative touch they'd shared on the terrace at the gala. This was desperate and hungry, 2 weeks of careful restraint dissolving in the space of a heartbeat. Jackson's arms came around her, pulling her against him as if he could somehow merge their bodies through sheer force of will. Daisy's hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring herself as the world tilted around them. She tasted like wine and possibility, like everything Jackson had been searching for without knowing it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the moonlight revealed faces flushed with passion and wonder. "This changes everything," Daisy said, her voice shaky but certain. "I know." Jackson rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face as if she might disappear if he let go. "Are you ready for that?" Daisy smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "I've been ready for 2 years. The question is whether you're ready to stop treating me like your assistant and start treating me like your equal." "More than equal," Jackson said fiercely. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I intend to spend as long as it takes proving that I'm worthy of you." As they walked the rest of the way to their suite, hands clasped together in the moonlight, Jackson felt like everything in his life had finally clicked into place. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by something real and deep and infinitely precious. Tomorrow they would return to Seattle and face the challenges of navigating a relationship under the scrutiny of colleagues and competitors. But tonight, in the romantic beauty of Napa Valley with the woman he loved, finally in his arms, Jackson Rowland felt like the luckiest man alive. Chapter 7. The Sabotage. The malicious whispers began on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Jackson and Daisy had returned from Napa Valley, glowing with newfound love and carefully hidden happiness. Jackson should have known that their secret couldn't last forever in the fishbowl environment of corporate Seattle, where gossip traveled faster than stock prices and relationships were dissected with the ruthless precision of quarterly earnings reports. He'd been vigilant about maintaining professional boundaries during business hours, but love had a way of revealing itself in subtle gestures, the way his hand lingered when passing documents, how his voice softened when addressing her in meetings, the protective stance he unconsciously adopted whenever other men spoke to her. But he'd been so intoxicated by the joy of finally being with Daisy that he'd ignored the warning signs, the speculative glances from colleagues, the sudden silences when he entered rooms, the way conversations seemed to pivot whenever Daisy's recent promotion to business development director was mentioned. The promotion had been long overdue, a formal recognition of contributions she'd been making for years without proper acknowledgement or compensation. Jackson had announced it with professional pride, detailing her innovative strategies for the Asian market expansion and her instrumental role in salvaging the Yamamoto deal. Every word had been true, every accolade earned through brilliance and dedication. But corporate America had a way of twisting truth into something ugly, and Jackson was about to learn exactly how devastating that transformation could be. He was reviewing quarterly projections in his office when his phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Webb. "We need to talk. Conference room B, now." The urgency in the message made Jackson's stomach clench with familiar dread. Marcus only used that tone when delivering catastrophic news, and Jackson couldn't think of any current crises that warranted such secrecy. Conference Room B was tucked away on the 39th floor, far from the executive suite and the curious ears that seemed to multiply whenever sensitive discussions were needed. Jackson found Marcus there along with Patricia Wells and Director of Human Resources, Jennifer Singh, their faces wearing the carefully neutral expressions of people about to destroy someone's life. "What's this about?" Jackson asked, settling into his chair with the controlled calm he'd perfected during decades of high-stakes negotiations. Jennifer slid a manila folder across the polished table toward him. "We've received some concerning allegations that require immediate attention." Jackson opened the folder and felt the blood drain from his face. Inside were printed emails, text message screenshots, and what appeared to be security camera stills from various locations around the building. But it was the cover letter that made his hands shake with rage. The document was typed on expensive letterhead belonging to Blake Ashworth's law firm, and it detailed allegations of sexual harassment, workplace favoritism, and abuse of power. According to the meticulously crafted narrative, Jackson had been coercing sexual favors from his assistant in exchange for professional advancement, creating a hostile work environment through quid pro quo harassment, and violating company policies regarding romantic relationships between supervisors and subordinates. "This is bullshit," Jackson said, his voice deadly quiet. "Complete malicious bullshit designed to destroy both my reputation and Daisy's career." "We understand your position," Patricia said carefully, "but we have to investigate these allegations thoroughly. The evidence presented is substantial." Jackson looked at the doctored photographs again, seeing how cleverly they'd been selected and edited. An image of him placing his hand on Daisy's back as they entered a restaurant became evidence of inappropriate touching. A photo of them standing close together in his office was presented as proof of improper behavior during business hours. Even their innocent lunch meetings had been documented and twisted into evidence of misconduct. "Where did this come from?" Jackson demanded, though he already knew the answer. "The complaint was filed anonymously," Jennifer replied, "but the accompanying evidence suggests someone with intimate knowledge of your daily routines and access to building security footage. Blake Ashworth." It had to be Blake, striking back after his failed attempt at corporate espionage had cost him several lucrative contracts and his reputation among Seattle's business elite. But Blake was too smart to attack Jackson directly. Instead, he'd chosen to target the woman Jackson loved, knowing that destroying Daisy would be the cruelest possible revenge. "I want to see Miss Renton immediately," Jackson said, starting to rise from his chair. "That's not advisable," Jennifer said quickly. "Given the nature of these allegations, any contact between you and Ms. Renton during the investigation could be viewed as intimidation or further evidence of inappropriate behavior." The implications hit Jackson like a physical blow. Not only was Blake trying to destroy Daisy's career, but he'd also effectively isolated her from the one person who could defend her. Jackson was trapped by the very policies designed to protect employees from actual harassment. "How long will this investigation take?" Jackson asked, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. 4 to 6 weeks minimum," Patricia replied. During that time, Ms. Renton will be placed on administrative leave with full pay and will need you to refrain from any contact with her outside of official company business. Administrative leave. The words were corporate speak for professional exile, a gentle way of removing someone from the workplace while their reputation was systematically destroyed. Jackson knew that regardless of the investigation's outcome, the mere fact that allegations had been made would follow Daisy for the rest of her career. This is exactly what Blake Ashworth wanted, Jackson said, his anger finally breaking through his professional restraint. He's using our own policies as weapons against us. Mr. Rowland, Jennifer's voice carried a warning edge. I strongly advise you not to make accusations without evidence. The investigation will be thorough and impartial, and the truth will emerge. But Jackson knew better. Corporate investigations were designed to protect companies, not individuals. Even if Daisy was completely exonerated, the whispers would follow her forever. People would always wonder if she'd really earned her success or simply slept her way to the top. The meeting ended with Jackson feeling like he'd been flayed alive. He returned to his office to find Daisy's desk empty, her personal belongings already packed into a box that sat on her chair, like an accusation. The sight made his chest constrict with rage and helplessness. His phone rang and Jackson answered without checking the caller ID, hoping against hope that it might be Daisy. Jackson, my boy. Blake Ashworth's voice oozed false sympathy through the speaker. I heard about your little personnel problem. Such a shame when workplace relationships become complicated. You son of a bitch, Jackson snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. You orchestrated this entire thing. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Blake replied with obvious satisfaction, though I have to say I'm surprised you were so careless. Dating your assistant? Really, Jackson, it's such a cliché. And poor Ms. Renton, such a promising career, cut short by scandal. One has to wonder if she'll ever recover from something like this. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Blake wasn't just attacking their relationship. He was threatening to destroy Daisy's professional future entirely. Jackson could weather a scandal. He had money, connections, and a reputation built over decades. But Daisy was vulnerable in ways that made Jackson's protective instincts scream with fury. What do you want? Jackson asked, his voice barely controlled. Nothing dramatic, Blake said airily. Perhaps a few strategic contract cancellations. Maybe you could reconsider that patent dispute we've been having. Small gestures of goodwill between colleagues. And if I refuse? Well, investigations can be so unpredictable. Evidence has a way of surfacing at inconvenient times. Witnesses sometimes remember details they'd previously forgotten. You never know what might emerge during a thorough examination of workplace relationships. Jackson closed his eyes, feeling the trap closing around him. Blake had engineered a perfect checkmate. Jackson could sacrifice his business interests to protect Daisy, or he could fight back and risk even more damaging revelations being manufactured. I need time to consider your suggestions, Jackson said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need, though I wouldn't wait too long. Reputations are such fragile things, and once they're damaged, they're nearly impossible to repair. The line went dead, leaving Jackson alone in his office with the taste of defeat in his mouth. Through his windows, Seattle sprawled below him in all its rain-soaked glory, indifferent to the personal catastrophe unfolding 42 stories above the street. Jackson tried calling Daisy, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried texting, but received no response. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her apartment, to explain what was happening and plan their defense together. But he knew that any contact would only provide more ammunition for Blake's attack. As the day wore on, Jackson watched his company begin to fracture under the weight of whispered rumors and speculation. Employees clustered in hallways, their conversations stopping abruptly when he passed. Clients called with carefully worded concerns about workplace stability and leadership accountability. Business partners began distancing themselves from potential scandal. By evening, Jackson understood exactly what Blake had accomplished. This wasn't just an attack on Jackson and Daisy's relationship. It was a systematic assault on everything they'd built together. Blake had weaponized society's double standards about powerful men and ambitious women, turning their love into something tawdry and transactional. Jackson stood in his empty office as darkness fell over the city, surrounded by the empire he'd spent his life building, but feeling utterly powerless to protect the one person who mattered most. Somewhere in the city below, Daisy was facing this nightmare alone, probably believing that Jackson had abandoned her to save his own reputation. The thought of her sitting in her apartment, surrounded by packed boxes and shattered dreams, filled Jackson with a rage so pure it took his breath away. Blake Ashworth had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that Jackson would choose his business over his heart. But as Jackson stared out at the city lights, a cold determination settled over him like armor. Blake wanted a war. He was about to get one, and Jackson Rawlins was prepared to burn down everything he'd built if that's what it took to protect the woman he loved. The battle lines were drawn, and Jackson had no intention of losing the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. Chapter 8. The Dark Period. 3 months after Daisy Renton disappeared from Jackson Rawlins' life, Seattle felt like a city of ghosts, every street corner holding memories that cut him like broken glass. Standing in his penthouse at 2 a.m., a tumbler of 30-year-old scotch untouched in his hand, he stared out at the city lights that had once symbolized possibility and ambition. Now they looked like funeral pyres, flickering reminders of everything he'd lost through his own cowardice and pride. The official investigation had concluded after 6 weeks, finding no evidence of harassment or misconduct. The allegations had been revealed as fabricated, the evidence doctored, the anonymous complaint traced back to sources connected to Blake Ashworth's organization. Daisy had been completely exonerated, her reputation officially cleared, and offered full reinstatement with a substantial salary increase and public apology. But the damage had already been done. During those 6 weeks of administrative leave, while Jackson had been legally prevented from contacting her, Daisy had watched from the sidelines as her colleagues whispered and speculated. She'd endured the humiliation of having her professional relationships scrutinized and her personal life dissected by strangers. Most devastating of all, she'd waited for Jackson to break protocol, to fight the system, to choose her over corporate procedure. And he hadn't. Jackson had followed the rules, trusting that legal vindication would be enough to heal the wounds Blake's attack had inflicted. But vindication couldn't erase the memory of sitting alone in her apartment, wondering if the man she loved would prioritize her heart over his company's liability concerns. When the offer of reinstatement came, Daisy had already accepted the truth. Jackson would always choose the safe, strategic path over the bold gesture of love she needed. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been so focused on protecting her from Blake's machinations that he'd failed to protect her from the one thing that could truly destroy her, his own inability to fight for their love when it mattered most. The weeks following the scandal had been a masterclass in corporate damage control. Jackson's legal team had dismantled Blake's attack with surgical precision, exposing the fabricated evidence and threatening lawsuits that would have bankrupted lesser men. Blake himself had retreated in defeat, his reputation in ruins and his business empire crumbling under the weight of his own malicious schemes. But Jackson's victory felt hollow as ashes. He'd won the war but lost the only battle that mattered, the fight for Daisy's trust and heart. The sound of his phone ringing cut through the silence of his penthouse, and Jackson glanced at the screen with the weary resignation of a man who no longer expected good news. Marcus Webb's name appeared, and Jackson considered ignoring it entirely. His CTO had been treating him with kid gloves for weeks, tiptoeing around conversations that might trigger Jackson's increasingly volatile temper. "What is it, Marcus?" Jackson answered, not bothering to hide his irritation. "I found her." The words hit Jackson like an electric shock, and the Scotch glass slipped from his nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor. "What did you say?" "Daisy. I found her. She's in New Orleans, and Jackson. She started her own company." New Orleans. Of course she'd gone home to the city that had shaped her strength and resilience, the place where she could rebuild her life away from the toxic atmosphere of Seattle's corporate scene. Jackson closed his eyes, picturing her in the sultry embrace of the French Quarter, surrounded by the music and culture that had formed her beautiful soul. "Tell me everything," Jackson said, his voice rough with emotions he'd been suppressing for months. "Renton Consulting. She specializes in corporate crisis management and strategic development. According to my sources, she's already landed several major clients, including 2 Fortune 500 companies that were impressed by her handling of our Yamamoto situation. Word travels fast in crisis management circles, and her reputation for discretion and results is spreading throughout the Gulf Coast business community." Jackson felt a surge of pride cut through his despair. Of course, Daisy was succeeding. Her brilliance couldn't be contained by scandal or geography, and she was too strong to let Blake Ashworth's attack define her future. "Has she... Is there anyone?" Jackson couldn't finish the question, but Marcus understood. "No romantic attachments that I could find. She's been focused entirely on building her business." The relief that flooded through Jackson was immediate and overwhelming. He'd spent countless sleepless nights imagining Daisy in someone else's arms, finding comfort with a man who had appreciated her from the beginning instead of taking years to recognize her worth. "I want her address," Jackson said, already moving toward his bedroom to pack. "Jackson, wait." Marcus's voice carried a warning that made him pause. "There's something else you need to know. I reached out to her through mutual contacts, tried to explain what really happened with the investigation, how we proved Blake orchestrated everything. And she knows. She's known for weeks. But Jackson, she doesn't want to see you. She's made it very clear that she considers that chapter of her life closed." The words hit Jackson harder than any physical blow could have. Daisy knew he'd been vindicated, knew that Blake's attack had been exposed and defeated, but she still didn't want him in her life. The realization that her absence wasn't based on misunderstanding, but on genuine rejection, made Jackson's legs go weak. "Did she say why?" Jackson asked, sinking into a chair as the weight of his failures crashed over him. "She said you had your chance to fight for her when it mattered, and you chose your reputation over her heart. She said she couldn't be with someone who would abandon her the moment things got difficult." Jackson closed his eyes, remembering those awful weeks when corporate policy had prevented him from contacting Daisy directly, when every instinct had screamed at him to ignore the rules and go to her anyway. He told himself he was being strategic, that following proper procedures would ultimately protect her better than any grand gesture. But Daisy had seen his caution as abandonment, his strategic thinking as cowardice. And she wasn't wrong. "She's not going to give you another chance," Marcus continued gently. "I'm sorry, Jackson, but I think you need to accept that and move on." Move on. As if Jackson could simply forget the woman who had become the center of his universe, who had shown him what love really meant, who had made him want to be better than he'd ever imagined possible. "Get me her address anyway," Jackson said quietly. "I need to try." "Jackson, get me her address, Marcus. That's not a request." After Marcus hung up, Jackson stood in his silent penthouse and began to plan. He couldn't call Daisy or text her, couldn't send flowers or gifts that could be easily ignored or returned. If he was going to reach her, it would have to be through actions, not words. He would have to prove that he'd learned from his mistakes, that he was finally ready to fight for their love with the same ruthless determination he brought to everything else. Over the following weeks, Jackson threw himself into a campaign more complex and challenging than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Working through intermediaries and shell companies, he began quietly investing in New Orleans businesses, particularly those owned by women and minorities. He established a scholarship fund at Tulane University in honor of Daisy's late father, a professor who had instilled in her the love of learning that had shaped her brilliant mind. Jackson donated anonymously to hurricane relief efforts, funded small business loans for entrepreneurs in underserved communities, and sponsored arts programs in the Ninth Ward. Every action was designed to make New Orleans a better place, the kind of city where someone like Daisy could thrive and build the life she deserved. But even as Jackson poured his resources into these efforts, he knew they were just the foundation of a larger campaign. Money could solve many problems, but it couldn't repair the damage he'd done to Daisy's trust. For that, he would need something much more precious and difficult to give: his complete vulnerability and willingness to risk everything for love. The phone rang again, interrupting his brooding. This time, it was Jennifer Singh from Human Resources, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering potentially explosive news. "Jackson, we've received an interesting call. Daisy Renton's attorney contacted us about the non-compete clause in her employment contract." Jackson felt his heart skip a beat. Daisy was making a move, and he couldn't predict what it might be. What about the non-compete? "She's arguing that the hostile work environment created by Blake Ashworth's attack voided the contract. She wants to be released from all restrictions so she can pursue clients in markets where we're active." The legal maneuvering was brilliant, a chess move that would free Daisy to compete directly with Rawlent Industries while simultaneously establishing a public record of the damage Blake's attack had caused. But more importantly, it was a message meant specifically for Jackson. Daisy was telling him that she was strong enough to stand against him professionally, that she didn't need his protection or his guilt-driven largesse. "Grant her request," Jackson said immediately. "Full release from all contractual obligations, and make sure she gets a formal apology from the company for the way the situation was handled." "Jackson, are you sure? This could open us up to significant competition." "I'm sure. Do it today." As Jackson hung up the phone, he felt something shift inside him, a crystallization of purpose that cut through months of despair and self-recrimination. Daisy was fighting back, reclaiming her power and independence with the same quiet strength that had first attracted him. She was showing him exactly what kind of man she needed. Not someone who would try to shield her from the world, but someone who would stand beside her as an equal and trust her to handle whatever challenges came their way. For the first time in months, Jackson Rawlent smiled. The woman he loved was giving him one final chance to prove himself worthy of her, though she probably didn't even realize it. And this time he wasn't going to let fear or pride or strategic thinking get in the way of the most important fight of his life. The campaign for Daisy's heart was about to begin in earnest, and Jackson intended to win not through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but by becoming the man she'd always needed him to be. Chapter 9. The Grand Gesture. 9 months after Daisy Renton had vanished from his life, Jackson Rawlent stood in the boardroom of Rawlent Industries and did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He began dismantling his empire piece by carefully calculated piece. "Gentlemen, ladies," Jackson addressed his board of directors, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern as they reviewed the documents he'd presented. "What you're looking at is a complete restructuring proposal that will fundamentally alter the nature of this company." Patricia Wells, his CFO, looked up from the financial projections with barely concealed alarm. "Jackson, this plan would reduce your controlling interest to less than 30%. You'd essentially be giving away billions in assets." I'm aware of the financial implications, Jackson replied calmly, though his heart was racing with the magnitude of what he was proposing. But I believe this restructuring represents our best path forward for sustainable growth and social responsibility. The plan Jackson had spent months developing was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. He was proposing to donate 70% of his personal stake in Rowland Industries to a charitable foundation focused on education, small business development, and disaster relief, primarily in underserved communities throughout the Gulf Coast region. The remaining 30% would be restructured as employee ownership shares, giving every worker in the company a stake in its success. "This is corporate suicide," muttered Richard Stone, the board's longest-serving member. "What's brought on this sudden attack of philanthropy?" Jackson had been preparing for this question for weeks, crafting answers that were truthful without revealing the desperate personal motivation behind his actions. "I've come to realize that wealth without purpose is meaningless. Rowland Industries has the opportunity to become a force for positive change, not just another tech company focused solely on profit maximization." What he didn't say was that every decision had been shaped by months of painful self-reflection and a single driving question: what would make Daisy proud? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had begun with small changes, actually listening to his employees' concerns, researching the social impact of his business decisions, seeking mentorship from leaders who prioritized purpose alongside profit. Every charitable initiative, every community investment, every policy change had been designed not just to improve the world, but to prove that Jackson Rowland had finally internalized the lessons she'd been trying to teach him for years. The board meeting stretched for 4 hours, filled with heated discussions about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value. But Jackson had done his homework meticulously, consulting with the best legal and financial minds money could buy. He'd structured the plan to actually increase long-term shareholder value through improved ESG ratings, tax benefits, and enhanced corporate reputation. The restructuring was not only legal but strategically sound, positioning Rowland Industries as a leader in corporate social responsibility while maintaining its competitive edge in an increasingly socially conscious marketplace. When the final vote was taken, Jackson's proposal passed by a narrow margin of 6-5, setting in motion the largest voluntary wealth redistribution in corporate history. As the board members filed out, their faces wearing expressions ranging from admiration to bewilderment, Jackson allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Phase 2 was more personal and infinitely more terrifying. Jackson had spent months learning everything he could about Daisy's new life in New Orleans. Through discreet inquiries and careful observation, he'd discovered that she was not only succeeding professionally, but thriving personally. Renton Consulting had become one of the most respected crisis management firms in the South, with a client list that included major corporations and municipal governments throughout the region. More importantly, Daisy had become deeply involved in her community. She volunteered at literacy programs in the lower Ninth Ward, served on the board of a nonprofit focused on hurricane preparedness, and had quietly funded the renovation of her old elementary school. She was using her success to lift up the community that had shaped her, embodying the values of service and compassion that Jackson had been too blind to appreciate during their years together. But it was the scholarship program that had given Jackson his opening. The Renton Dupuis Educational Foundation, named for Daisy's late parents, provided full tuition support for academically gifted students from low-income families. He'd learned about it through his own charitable research, and after careful investigation, he'd made a strategic decision that would either open the door to reconciliation or close it forever. The anonymous donation had been substantial enough to fully endow the foundation for decades to come, ensuring that hundreds of students would receive the educational opportunities Daisy believed everyone deserved. Jackson had included a single condition. The donor's identity would remain secret unless Daisy specifically requested disclosure. For 6 weeks, Jackson had waited for some response, some sign that Daisy had connected the dots between the massive donation and the restructuring of Roland Industries that had made international news. But her silence had been absolute, leaving Jackson to wonder if his gesture had been too subtle or if Daisy simply didn't care about his attempts at redemption. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning, his phone rang with a number he recognized from months of memorization. Daisy's direct line at Renton Consulting. "This is Jackson," he answered, his voice carefully controlled despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Hello, Jackson." Daisy's voice was exactly as he remembered, warm and professional with an undertone of steel that had always taken his breath away. "I believe we need to talk." The simple statement contained multitudes. Jackson had been preparing for this conversation for months, crafting arguments and explanations and apologies. But now that the moment had arrived, all his careful preparation crumbled into dust. "Yes," he said simply, "we do. I assume you're familiar with the recent donation to my foundation." "I may have heard something about it," Jackson replied, not quite ready to admit his involvement without understanding her reaction. There was a pause, and Jackson could picture Daisy sitting at her desk in her New Orleans office, probably wearing one of those elegant but professional dresses that had always made him forget whatever he'd been thinking about. The mental image was so vivid it made his chest ache with longing. "The donor's lawyers were very careful to maintain anonymity," Daisy continued, "but there are certain patterns in the paperwork that remind me of someone I used to know. Someone with a particular fondness for complex legal structures and unnecessarily elaborate corporate maneuvering." Despite everything, Jackson found himself smiling. Trust Daisy to see through his carefully constructed anonymity. She'd always been too intelligent to fool, even when he'd been arrogant enough to try. "And if this someone you used to know was hypothetically involved in the donation?" Jackson asked carefully. "Then I would want to know why." Daisy's voice carried no emotion Jackson could identify. Not anger, not gratitude, nothing that would give him a clue about what she was thinking. Why now, after all this time? Why this particular cause? Jackson closed his eyes, knowing that this was the moment where everything would be decided. He could give her a diplomatic answer, something about corporate social responsibility and tax advantages. Or he could tell her the truth and risk having his heart broken beyond repair. "Because I finally understand what you were trying to teach me," he said quietly. "That success without purpose is meaningless. That power without compassion is just sophisticated bullying. That love without action is just pretty words." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of months of separation and years of misunderstanding. Jackson held his breath, waiting for Daisy's response and praying that he hadn't waited too long to learn the lessons she'd been offering all along. "I see," Daisy said finally, and Jackson caught something in her voice that might have been surprise or might have been hope. "And you thought funding my foundation would demonstrate this newfound understanding?" "I thought it might be a start," Jackson admitted. "Along with restructuring my entire company to prioritize social responsibility over profit maximization, and publicly acknowledging that Blake Ashworth's attack was successful because I was too much of a coward to fight for you when it mattered." Another pause, this one shorter but somehow more intense. "You made that acknowledgement publicly?" "In the Wall Street Journal, Fortune magazine, and Harvard Business Review. I figured if I was going to admit to being an idiot, I might as well do it comprehensively." For the first time since the conversation began, Jackson heard something that might have been laughter in Daisy's voice. "That must have been humbling for someone with your ego." "Devastating," Jackson agreed, "but nowhere near as humbling as realizing I'd lost the most important thing in my life because I was too proud to admit I needed help learning how to love someone properly." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and completely vulnerable. Jackson had just handed Daisy the power to destroy him with a few words, and they both knew it. "Jackson," Daisy said softly, and the way she said his name made his heart skip a beat. "What exactly are you asking for?" "A chance," Jackson replied without hesitation. "Not to go back to what we had, because I know that's impossible, but a chance to show you who I've become, who you inspired me to be. A chance to prove that I'm finally ready to love you the way you've always deserved." The silence that followed was the longest of Jackson's life. Through his office windows, Seattle sprawled below him in all its rain-soaked glory, but Jackson barely saw it. His entire world had narrowed to the phone in his hand and the woman on the other end of the line who held his future in her voice. "I'll think about it," Daisy said finally, and Jackson felt hope bloom in his chest like a flower after a long winter. "But Jackson, if I give you this chance, if I let you back into my life, there won't be another one. This is it. Everything or nothing." "I understand," Jackson said, his voice thick with emotion. "And Daisy, thank you for even considering it, for being willing to believe that people can change." "People can change," Daisy agreed quietly. "The question is whether they change enough and whether they change in time. I guess we'll find out." As the line went dead, Jackson set his phone down with shaking hands and allowed himself to believe, for the first time in months, that love might be enough after all. Chapter 10. The Reunion. The sultry New Orleans evening wrapped around Jackson Rowland like a living thing as he stood at the entrance to the French Quarter courtyard where Daisy's life had been reborn without him. 2 years had passed since their phone conversation, 2 years of the most excruciating patience Jackson had ever endured. True to her word, Daisy had thought about his request for a second chance. She'd thought about it for over a year and a half, during which Jackson had proven his transformation through actions rather than words, building a reputation for corporate responsibility that had fundamentally altered how business was conducted in Seattle. But thinking, Jackson had learned, was not the same as deciding, and Daisy Renton had become a master of keeping her own counsel. Tonight marked the second anniversary of Renton Consulting, and Jackson had received an invitation that had arrived without explanation or context. Just elegant script on cream-colored paper bearing the address and time. Whether it was an invitation to reconciliation or a final goodbye, Jackson couldn't tell. But he'd flown to New Orleans anyway, because the alternative was living the rest of his life, wondering what might have been. The courtyard was transformed into something from a fairy tale, with Spanish moss draped in twinkling lights and jazz music drifting from a small ensemble in the corner. Magnolia blossoms perfumed the air, and the soft glow of lanterns cast everything in warm, romantic light. The crowd was a mixture of New Orleans society and business professionals, all celebrating the remarkable woman who had built something beautiful from the ashes of her shattered dreams. And there she was. Daisy moved through her guests like a queen holding court, radiant in a flowing emerald dress that made her skin glow like burnished gold. She was even more beautiful than Jackson remembered, if such a thing were possible. Success had given her an additional layer of confidence, a regal bearing that spoke of a woman who had faced the worst and emerged stronger than ever. Jackson's hands shook as he watched her laugh at something a distinguished older gentleman was saying, her joy so genuine and infectious that everyone around her seemed to lean closer, drawn by her magnetic warmth. This was what she'd become without him. Not just successful, but truly happy. The realization was both devastating and wonderful. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Jackson turned to find a petite woman with fierce eyes and protective energy radiating from every pore. This had to be Nia, Daisy's best friend and self-appointed guardian angel. Jackson had heard about her from their mutual contacts, a successful attorney who had no patience for men who broke her best friend's heart. "Nia, I presume," Jackson said, offering a slight bow. "Daisy's spoken of you often. Has she now?" Nia's tone could have frozen the Mississippi River. "Funny, because she hasn't spoken of you at all, not once in the past year and a half." The words hit their mark with surgical precision, but Jackson had expected them. He'd known that coming here would mean facing the protective fury of everyone who loved Daisy, everyone who had witnessed her pain and helped her rebuild her life. "I don't blame her," Jackson said quietly, "or you for wanting to protect her from me." "Damn right I want to protect her." Nia stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. "Do you have any idea what you put her through? Do you know how many nights I held her while she cried over a man who was too much of a coward to fight for her?" Each word was a knife to Jackson's heart, but he accepted the pain as his due. "I know, and I'll regret that cowardice for the rest of my life." "Regret isn't enough," Nia said flatly. "Daisy deserves better than pretty apologies and guilt-driven grand gestures." "You're right," Jackson agreed, his eyes finding Daisy across the courtyard again. "She deserves everything." Before Nia could respond, a hush fell over the gathering as Daisy stepped onto a small platform near the fountain. The fairy lights caught in her hair like captured starlight, and when she spoke, her voice carried the warm honey of her Louisiana roots, mixed with the confidence of hard-won success. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her smile encompassing the entire gathering. "2 years ago, I came home to New Orleans with nothing but a broken heart and a determination to build something meaningful. Tonight, we're celebrating not just the success of Renton Consulting, but the power of community, resilience, and the courage to begin again." Jackson felt his breath catch at the phrase "second chances," though he couldn't tell if it was directed at him or spoken in general terms. "This company exists because of the people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," Daisy continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "My mama, who taught me that grace under pressure is the greatest strength any woman can possess. My dear friend Nia, who reminded me that I was worthy of love and respect, even when I'd forgotten it myself. And all of you who trusted a woman starting over to help you solve your most complex challenges." As Daisy spoke about gratitude and growth, Jackson felt the weight of every mistake he'd made settling on his shoulders. She'd built this beautiful life, surrounded herself with people who cherished her, created a business that reflected her values of service and excellence. What right did he have to disrupt her peace with his belated realization of her worth? "But tonight isn't just about looking back." Daisy's voice drew Jackson from his self-recrimination. "It's about looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that await us. Because I've learned that sometimes the greatest growth comes from facing the things that scare us most." Her eyes found his across the courtyard, and Jackson felt the world stop spinning. In that moment, with fairy lights dancing around her and the soft New Orleans night wrapping them both in possibility, Jackson saw something in Daisy's gaze that made his heart race with desperate hope, recognition, invitation, and perhaps, if he wasn't imagining it, forgiveness. The speech ended to thunderous applause, and Jackson watched as Daisy was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and admirers. He hung back, uncertain whether to approach or give her space, when he felt a hand on his arm. "She knew you were coming," Nia said quietly, her hostile demeanor softened into something that might have been resignation. "She's known for weeks. The invitation wasn't an accident." Jackson's heart leaped. "Then why?" "Because she needed to see if you'd come anyway, even knowing you might be walking into a room full of people who hate you for hurting her." Nia studied his face with the intensity of a prosecutor examining evidence. "She needed to know if you'd risk public humiliation for the chance to see her again." "I'd risk everything for her," Jackson said simply. I thought I'd proven that by now. Actions prove things, Naya agreed. But tonight is about something different. Tonight is about whether you've learned to be vulnerable, to admit when you're wrong, to put her happiness above your own pride. As if summoned by their conversation, Daisy appeared at Jackson's side with the fluid grace that had always taken his breath away. Up close, she was even more magnificent, her skin glowing with health and happiness, her eyes bright with intelligence and something that might have been mischief. "Hello, Jackson," she said, her voice carrying the familiar professional warmth that had once driven him mad with longing. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me," Jackson replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Though I wasn't sure if it was an invitation or a test. Daisy's smile was enigmatic. Can't it be both? The simple question contained multitudes, and Jackson realized that this was indeed a test, perhaps the most important one of his life. Not a test of his wealth or power or ability to make grand gestures, but a test of his character, his growth, his willingness to be the man she needed, rather than the man he'd always been. "Yes," Jackson said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "It can be both. And for what it's worth, I hope I pass." "We'll see," Daisy replied, but there was warmth in her voice that made Jackson's chest tight with hope. "We'll see." The night was young, filled with music and laughter and the intoxicating promise of new beginnings. And as Jackson followed Daisy deeper into the celebration of her remarkable life, he realized that he was no longer the arrogant businessman who had once thought love could be conquered like a corporate takeover. He was just a man, humbled and hopeful, ready to prove that sometimes the greatest victory was learning to surrender your heart completely to the person who had always deserved it.